Hey everyone, it's Samuel.
And I'm Dave.
And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons.
Today, in the prime material, building authentic societies.
In the wilds, the Nilbog.
And in the tavern, what would you do if there was a full moon?
It's great to have another member of the Plot Hooks team on the podcast again. Welcome back, Dave.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Ever since COVID-19 started a few months ago, it's been a little bit harder organizing, getting us together on the mic, but we're happy to have another member of the team back today to discuss building authentic societies. Before we get into that today, just a few announcements to get out of the way. Of course, remember to follow us on all our social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You can find us on YouTube as well if you'd like to listen to the podcast that way. We'd also appreciate a rating on whatever feed you happen to listen to the podcast on. And finally, it would be awesome of you to support us on Patreon. We're actually in the middle of the process of revamping it, adding some more tiers, including a tier which will allow you to be a part of a brand new show that we're bringing you, Plot Hooks Adventures, which is going to be a show where we bring together different members of the TTRPG community to do one-shots set in our world of Carrick. So you'll have that new option and even more options up there for you on Patreon. There's, of course, a lot of other awesome perks that have already been up there, like all of our supplement information, our homebrew information for the world of Carrick. Your support is just really appreciated. It helps us make this podcast better for you each and every day. All right. Well, without further ado, let's dive into building authentic societies. Now, when you were last on, Dave, back in episode 14, we looked at creating authentic histories and ruins for our settings. Mm-hmm. You, with your background in, or not even background, your profession of anthropology and archaeology, mm-hmm. Looking at how we can create past civilizations in our worlds in a manner that as we interact with them in the present in our games, it feels real, it feels legitimate and authentic.
Yeah.
Well, today, we're moving away from creating authentic civilizations and peoples of the past, and we're looking at making authentic societies of the present. Every setting has a wide variety of races and people groups, each with their own habits, cultures, lifestyles, societies, and especially for those of us that homebrew a lot, we often create whole new peoples for our worlds, or at least unique bastions of civilizations that are made up of existing D&D races. But regardless of the circumstances, we get put in a place constantly as DMs and players where we have the task of making a current society feel authentic. As a player, we're tasked with describing the environments our player grew up in, as well as our people's beliefs and customs. And as a DM, we're tasked with doing that for our entire world, building out every location that the party happens to be in. And to me, few things make me lose my sense of immersion more in my games and my worlds than stuff feeling really fake, than a society just not making any sense at all. So today we want to just explore what factors we need to think about in order to make sure that our current people groups and civilizations in our world feel authentic.
Yeah, so I think I want to go through this by maybe posing some questions to people who are going through this process of thinking about creating fictional societies. And hopefully the questions will, be the sort of things that help players and DMs focus their creative energies productively. And so the first question I want to ask is, where do these people live? What sort of challenges or advantages might that pose? And there's a few ways that that's going to create some, we'll say maybe creative limitations for DMs. And the first would be, what kind of building materials would be available, or what do they need to build based on the environment? And so, I guess maybe we'll talk about this sort of the natural environment and what kind of limitations that might put on what you can do. And this came up also in our discussion last time when we talked about ruins. And it's also going to be very relevant here. I mean, it's a lot of the same rules we'll touch on again, maybe, or come back a little bit. And this is definitely one of those examples.
Sure. That's one of the things that I know I don't often think about. But whenever you're talking about a particular society, where they're located is a huge factor of exactly what that society looks like on a daily basis. It affects the habits of the individuals, and just even the basic things, as what you said, is what the structures are made out of, how they have to be made. Are they on a coastline that maybe has frequent storms? Well, their buildings should be at least rather sturdy. They're not going to be made of flimsy wood unless that's all they have available, in which case you have a society that is just building temporary structures because they keep being knocked down every summer whenever typhoon season hits.
Right. And if that's the case, then they have to find a way to construct their buildings in a way that is that I don't know that they can be knocked over, and it's not that big of a deal, right? So that they wouldn't be expending that much energy building their buildings if they know every year these are getting knocked down.
You think of even like at the beach where you've got just houses designed for water to flow through the ground level. Just designed where if that flood that inevitably will occur whenever a hurricane on the east coast of the United States where we're at, whenever that inevitably will happen, the water could just flow through the bottom layer where all the cars park or whatever without actually harming a living space unless it gets really high. And, just there are concessions that we even make in real life to our structures based on what we have available to us and the conditions around us in our environment.
Yeah, right. I mean, if you're an architect building buildings in San Francisco, you've got some some serious considerations there with regard to earthquakes that you wouldn't have if you're an architect working in North Carolina where we are. So yeah, those kinds of natural constraints are really important, and it's something that you probably want to think about. Another really important thing related to the environment is what sort of food resources are available. If we're sticking with your example of beach living, right? If you're living on the coast, you've got great access to marine resources, but the soil might not be great, right? Planting in sandy soil along the beach is not going to be that productive. You've got sort of brackish water that might not be conducive to growing crops. And so you might have some sort of considerations there. And what we eat is incredibly important, and not just in the sense of we need it to survive. It also forms a lot of important basis of how we think about ourselves or the world. An example might be, so the area that I work in, Central America, is the Maya area. And in Maya mythology, people are sculpted from cornmeal. And corn was and continues to be the most important crop in the Maya area. And I guess now you could probably argue worldwide. And for the ancient Maya, there was literally a belief that humans were made from sculpted cornmeal. And so the food that we eat even creates these, or maybe informs the sort of myths that we create about the world around us.
Yeah. Whenever you're creating a society, it's also not a society that is generally isolated. You're going to have trade within the different cities and towns and villages in your setting. And so, this could play into what kind of commerce is there, what the economy looks like, what the trade looks like. Again, just this beach example, the first thing that makes me think of when what you are talking about is, lack of real crops, but you're in the marine area with lots of fish and things like that. The first thing it makes me think of is the export of salted meats, because you've got salt right there in the ocean where you can quite easily just create a real big quantity of sea salt.
Yeah.
And in Dungeons and Dragons, unless you're playing in a futuristic setting, there's no refrigerators. So the meat has to be preserved in some way, whether it's by salting or smoking or what have you. And here you have this environment where you could create a really vibrant export system of salted meat and fish. And that's just based off of where they're at. This can play into the whole economy of the particular place. And then at the same time, that also gives you an opportunity to pull on something as a DM. Is something affecting that? Are the fish dying? Is something poisoning the water? Is something happening there which is actually affecting this small part of the world, but because it's so important to this society, it all of a sudden has an extreme impact. There's lots of different things that you can do with that as a DM.
Yeah, and this is something that like economists talk about in terms of comparative advantage, right? That like different people or different societies specialize in certain things based on what is easiest for them to do, or based on what they're best at, what they can do most efficiently, I guess. And environment is a huge part of what people are most effective at doing. You could get salt if you live far from the beach.
Yes, that's true.
But it's probably a lot easier if you live close to the beach.
Now, with all of these things, of course, when we're talking about a Dungeons and Dragons setting, there's the magic factor. And to a certain extent, you can kind of fudge any society as whatever you want based on wherever they live because of some magic related resource. Sure, they live in this extreme cold environment, but magic. And so if you want to, you can create whatever kind of society you want to a certain extent, but to make it feel legitimate and authentic, I still think that there should be a big connection between your society and where they actually live, because magic in Dungeons and Dragons, depending on your setting, it's something that is developed. It's something that is learned. It's the arcane is intelligence based. It's stuff that is learned. And while there's lots of non-arcane spellcasting, like the innate abilities of the sorcerer, you're still talking about a resource in magic which is largely developing. And so unless your society is a relatively recent one, it was still founded in an era where there might not have been quite as much magic. And now, while there might be magic which aids them in dealing with their particular environmental constraints, it was still a society that was founded without as much magic in many circumstances. So it should
another thing to keep in mind maybe is that magic has a cost, right? Like you don't just get to cast as many spells as you want every day, right? You have to expend effort and resources to cast spells. And so sure, you could you could get wizards to like make it hot all the time, but it's easier to just be in a hot place, right? If you're growing papayas or something, right? Like it'd be easier to just like go someplace hot than it would be to have like a team of wizards constantly keeping the weather in your polar region tropical feeling.
Sure. Absolutely. So that's the first question, thinking about where this particular society you're developing lives and what kind of advantages it poses. What's the second question?
Yeah, the second thing I would want people to think about is what are the important social categories in the society? And this is something that is actually a little bit challenging to think about because we oftentimes take social categories for granted, right? We're raised in our own societies and we're taught social categories early in life, and they often just feel like they feel natural, right? They feel like this is just the way things are.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of early anthropology focused on complicating those stories a little bit, right? A lot of early anthropologists were talking about things like coming of age ceremonies and sex and gender. And what those, people like Margaret Mead, what they found in their research is that other societies do coming of age and do gender in ways that are different from how we do them in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And it's worth thinking about that, and it can make a fictional society seem more authentic or immersive if it's got these things that feel a little bit weird, or
Mm-hmm.
make people feel like outsiders, right?
Sure.
So something like childhood, adulthood, old age, and death, right? That sort of progress through life and what kind of age categories exist is something that's worth thinking about, right? Does a
Mm-hmm.
society have some sort of coming of age ceremony?
Mm-hmm.
Is there something that separates adults from children, right?
Sure.
What happens at the moment of death? What do these people believe happens after death? What kind of preparations need to be made for death? Those sorts of things are worth thinking about.
Sure. This is something we had to work with, and we both worked together to develop as far as the Ichmaset were concerned, the race of people which we released in our supplement on our Patreon from our world of Carrick, because they have a pretty short lifespan. And in Dungeons and Dragons, where you're talking about things that are not just human, even lifespan is different.
Yep.
And that impacts your society. And this was something that we had to develop for them. How does childhood and coming of age work in this particular place?
Yeah.
And what we ended up coming up with was a concession to their particular environment where they live in the war wastes, and made it feel authentic, I think, but also quite weird and foreign
Yeah.
to the typical thing that we think of just as normal human society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's nice when there are certain little things you can latch onto and say, oh yeah, I recognize this as kind of like a coming of age ceremony.
Mm,
Um, but 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 it is unique in its own sort of set of weird ways that make it feel, maybe a little bit uncomfortable or interesting.
hmm
I would also want people thinking about family and how that works, right? So
mm,
anthropologists talk a lot about kinship and how kinship structures work, right? So how do people think about their family ties, right? Who is it that you're related to, and which of those relationships are most important, and what kind of responsibilities do those entail, right?
hmm
So there's plenty of languages, human language, human languages, to be clear. Normally, I
Sure.
wouldn't have to specify that, but yeah. Right, there's plenty of human languages where the word for mother and aunt is the same, right? Or it's
Mm,
connected, right? So like it would be literal translation might be big mother for your biological mother, and then small mother or something like that for your aunts, right? Same would be
mm,
true for father, right? Your biological father is your big father, and then your uncles are your other fathers.
mm,
And so in certain societies, we treat parenting as this sort of shared responsibility.
hmm
Whereas I think in the United States, most of us are used to a system in which you've got two parents or one parent, and they alone are responsible for those kinds of parenting responsibilities. And if somebody else does some parenting, it's crossing a line, right? That's
hmm
like
Yeah.
overstepping the bounds. Whereas in other societies, that is not true at all. And so
hmm
think about like what are the responsibilities of people, right? Do aunts and uncles have parenting responsibilities, right? Do aunts and uncles even count as family? Right.
mm
In the United States, we're used to tracing our ancestry through our mother and our father. Right. So you've
hmm
got aunts and uncles and cousins on your dad's side, and you've got aunts and uncles and cousins on your mom's side. in lots of societies, people only trace descent through the father's lineage. And in some societies, you only get it through the mother's lineage, although that's rarer. And if you're only tracing descent through the father's lineage, then your relatives on your mother's side are not your relatives in the same way, right? Because your mother has maybe married into your father's lineage, and she's no longer part of the other family from which she came, right?
Yeah.
And so those relationships between father's side and mother's side might be radically different. And so people do kinship in really, really different ways, and it's fun. And because this is something that we grow up with from from birth, right? It feels like there might not be other ways to set up systems like this. And so it's a great way to kind of put people on edge or make it feel different and weird, right? If you say, like, parenting responsibilities are shared communally.
Sure. And thinking about it in depth that way, I think can make it feel really authentic, because there's the temptation to try to do this at a base level by just switching up perhaps typical gender roles or something like that, where, oh, okay, this is not a patriarchal society like many traditional human societies were. This is a matriarchal society.
Yeah.
It's a society where the females are the dominant gender, and that is a way that you're trying to disrupt the norms, but it's I don't want to say it's lazy, but it's not getting to the core of what makes things different. You're just switching patriarchal for matriarchal, and it's changing a little bit, but if you really think down deep about family roles and societal roles of just the different people at different ages and races, if you've got different D&D races all working together in a society, if you think about how all that works together, then you're going to create a much more authentic society than just trying to create something really simple and an easy tweak, so to speak.
Yeah, right. And I think if you're doing, as you described, just sort of reversing what we're used to, there's a little bit less exploration for players to do around that, right? Because I imagine it sort of clicks pretty early on, and they say, "Oh, I see what you did. It's the same as our society, but it's like mirror universe version of it." And maybe that's a little bit less exciting, and maybe it also feels a little bit less realistic because you've taken so many of these same characteristics and just kind of flip them on their head. But there's a lot to think about with regard to family, and I would definitely encourage people to think about that, right? Also, just in terms of like, maybe this ties into our last social category of age, right? Where do people go when they are ready to be parents, right? Who are potential mates for them, right? Do they leave and go to some other town? Do they stay put, right? How does that work, right? I mean, that's sort of, in most societies, that transition from adult with no kids to adult with kids is really important. And plenty of people around the world would tell you you're not actually an adult until you have kids, right? As a 35-year-old with no kids, I sort of object to that particular characterization, but yeah, plenty of people will tell you that. And so it's worth thinking about that, right? Like is having kids an important step for these people? Probably it is. And what's involved in that? Where do they have to go? What do they have to do? What does coupling look like? Right? Humans are a pair bonding species, right? We love making these sorts of important one-on-one social connections in all kinds of capacities. And you see that in all human societies, but it's hard to come up with, right? Anthropologists have tried and failed to come up with an adequate definition of marriage that is truly universal, right? Because you can always find exceptions. And I've done a thing in cultural anthropology classes where I read outdated definitions of marriage to the class, and we sort of break them down. And it's always good for laughs, because even people trying to define marriage universally in, right, 50 years ago sound laughable to a modern college classroom.
Yeah.
So we've got lots of other social categories we can think about too. Things like political affiliations, ethnicity, gender, right? Obviously, in a D&D context, you've got all these different races that exist in the world. You've got races from different planes of existence, and so you've got to think about who is there, and just in general, what are the roles and expectations for people in those categories? Right? What does it mean for people in your society to be a man or a woman? Or maybe you are breaking down the sort of gender binary in your world in some way. What does that look like? Right? What are the expectations for people right, who have a different sense of ancestry? Right? And keep in mind that the bases and the consequences of these kinds of divisions aren't necessarily going to be things that are obvious to us, right? Again, we're raised with our own sense of what the social categories are, and I've often used an article that I love about Moroccan ethnicities. So when I've taught cultural anthropology at a couple different colleges, I've used this article because it talks about, the Haratin and the Berbers and the Arabs and all the expectations that come along with these specific ethnic groups in Morocco, and how certain groups are allowed to own property because there's this generally agreed upon idea that they have this deep ancestral connection to the land. And this other group, the Haratin, are excluded from, or historically, it's sort of changed, it's been changing for the last several decades, but historically, this one ethnic group has been excluded from property ownership because there's this idea in the society that they are sort of recent migrants to the area and they don't deserve it, right? And so one of the things I love about that example is that it's something that seems so weird to us, right? We're just not used to thinking about land ownership as something that would come with ethnic identity like that. So, feel free to get creative with it, right? I mean, all these different sorts of social roles can have radically different consequences depending on the society.
Yeah. And things like that, which used to exist, even if it's something that's farther in the past, it has present day manifestations in many different ways. You just look at our country in the United States, and even though there has been no quote unquote slavery for 150 years, the effects of that still exist to this day. Now, there's lots of other reasons for that, such as not really getting rid of slavery with things like sharecropping and things like Jim Crow and redlining, and we can go down the list of ways that white America kept the African American people down in many literal ways. But even if there was the proverbial snap of the finger, all of a sudden, in this particular society, there is now equality where there previously was not equality. There's still ramifications because of that past experience, even if it is just a perfect, okay, now we went from a completely imperfect society to now there's just complete, total 100% equality. There's still feelings and emotions that are connected with the oppressed group. All this to say just that events of the past in that way can have a big impact on your present in your society, even if it's not something that is currently a issue.
That's absolutely true. And you mentioned redlining. That the conversation that I always have in class related to that Moroccan ethnicity example always ends in a discussion of redlining, right? And so we bring these sort of same principles into our own society and talk about how, we might not necessarily think about land ownership as being associated with ethnicity in our own society, but historically it really is. And we had laws on the books for 40 or 50 years that explicitly racialized property ownership.
Mm-hmm.
And those sorts of factors don't just stop.
Yep.
Right. Even when the laws come off the books, people still have ideas, and there have been sets of norms and rules and expectations that have been established, and those tend to persist for a long time.
Mm-hmm. But this can also, of course, rounding out this second question, be something that's positive factor as well. You can
Sure.
have different social categories which can be very positive elements. Oftentimes, when trying to craft a story, it's easy as DMs to descend into, okay, how could I make this terrible so that they have to respond to it as a party? But making a really positive environment, such as our world of Carrick, where part of the onus for it was creating a world and making a legitimate world where racism was not the norm. And there can be really interesting positive things that you can do in a society by looking at handling social categories which we typically struggle with in our real life societies, and figuring out how it would be if it was just different, if it was just better handled in your fictional society in your game.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the next big question I would have is, what are the norms and mores of these people? And norms and mores are terms that anthropologists and sociologists use a lot. And what they mean are, so norms are the specific expectations of behavior in certain circumstances, and mores are the sort of general guiding principles that people might think about or invoke in lots of different circumstances, right? So for example, you might say that like honesty is important. That could be that would be a more, right? That's the kind of social rule that you're going to apply in lots of different circumstances, right? It's not a specific behavior that you must do in one circumstance. It's a guiding principle, right? These can be interesting because they sometimes come into conflict with one another, right? You might say that honesty is important is a more of American society. You might also say that being nice to people, right, is something that's generally important. What happens when someone gets you a gift you don't like, right?
Yeah.
Are you supposed to be honest, or are you supposed to be nice? You're supposed to be nice, right?
Yeah.
Right. So those are right, and so those kinds of rules are generally applicable across circumstances, but because of that, they might come into conflict occasionally, right? So I guess first things might be thinking about mores, right? What are the things that people generally value in this society? Are they different from what we might take for granted as social mores? Right. This is something I think that Star Trek does kind of to the extreme. Is they take when they introduce a new species, they're saying, okay, here these are the Vulcans, right? They don't care about feelings. They care about logic, right? And if you're trying to ingratiate yourself with a Vulcan, you really wouldn't want to try and butter them up, right? You would want to be brutally honest with them, right? And so those sorts of things can be fun because it really changes sort of strategies that you might have socially.
Sure.
In terms of social norms, right? These are really specific, right? And these are the specific expectations of behavior in a given circumstance. Anthropologists and people who just travel a lot for fun are often going to find themselves in circumstances where they don't know the norms, and it's often really awkward and funny. I mean, maybe it's fun. Maybe it's funny in hindsight, but not so funny as it's happening. So I work in the Mexican state of Quintana Roo, is where I do my field work, and I guess it was maybe our first summer there. Maybe it was our second summer. It was early on. We got invited over to a friend's house for dinner there. And we were expecting, everyone, we come over for dinner. There's a big table. We all gather around it, eat together, talk as we eat. We show up to their house for dinner, and there's just a table set for two people in the middle of the dining room. And they served us dinner, almost as if we were in a restaurant, and it felt so deeply uncomfortable to us. But we're the outsiders, and we're trying to we're trying to fit in and be nice to people, and we just kind of rolled with it. And then we socialized after dinner.
Interesting.
And so like thinking about that, so like what sort of activities are viewed as shared and communal, and what sort of activities are viewed as private? I had a friend in graduate school who did some work in Zambia, and when he showed up to do field work and started his homestay with a family there, the father of the family was showing him around the compound and said, and here's here's where you'll be sleeping, right? And it's like a sort of thatch hut with like a reed mat on the floor, and then he says, and obviously I won't let you sleep here by yourself tonight, so I'll sleep in here with you. And the guy's reaction is that no, like you don't have to sleep in this hut with me. Frankly, it would be much more comfortable for me if you didn't. And this guy's reaction was, nope, I insist. No one, I won't have a guest in my house sleeping alone on the first night. It would be rude, right? That would be unconscionable. And so, right, different people have different expectations regarding what is an activity that should be communal and what is one that should be private, and what are the ways in which it should be shared, right? And this guy was not going to take no for an answer because you're just not supposed to let someone sleep in a room by themselves, at least not the first night that they're staying with you.
Sure.
And so there's a lot of sort of room for fun cultural misunderstandings, and potentially sort of interesting conflicts that arise from those.
Yeah, and once you get to larger style societies, whenever you're talking about building out a particular city, which you want to be the New York City of your particular setting, where there's such a big cultural mishmash, sometimes those norms and those mores can conflict with one another a little bit. But as a general rule, I think it's easier to not focus too much on where the conflict would lie, unless that happens to be part of a hook for going to a particular town, but focus on finding things which will be overarching amongst all the different races and ethnic groups and difference of religion and stuff within your particular town. Find what norms are actually normal for the whole of the city and not just for a particular religious sect, so to speak. There's lots of different things which can be in conflict if you want to actually play it up, but it's not necessarily something that you have to do when you're building out a particular city or settlement.
Yeah. But I do think that you want that you really want to emphasize the sort of that sort of cultural cultural difference. And the reality is that those kinds of differences have led to, at least in our world, right, have led to a lot of misunderstandings.
Sure.
A lot of which have been quite bad. One example I often think of is potlatches, which are basically a really important social ritual in the Pacific Northwest, where indigenous groups that sort of come together and they will do this massive gift exchange. And among other things, it's a way of sort of redistributing wealth and building social connections. And the potlatch was banned by the Canadian government in, I think, the 1870s or 1880s, something like that. And because these white Canadians were showing up, seeing this ritual where people were coming together and just giving away all of these objects and then receiving new objects and then giving those away. And these outsiders were looking at it and saying, this is a waste of time, right? What are these people doing? Just like coming in here and just like giving things to each other back and forth. Like they could just all stay at home and just keep their stuff and they wouldn't have wasted all this effort. We have to save these people from their own terrible, wasteful tradition. And the reality is that like we actually, have many traditions in sort of modern Western society that are pretty similar to this. Most gift exchanges are like that, right? If you think about like just efficiency of money spent, like birthdays and Christmas and other gift exchanges are pretty inefficient, right? Like if I just gave you $20, you would spend it exactly how you wanted to spend it. If I spent it for you, I might get you something that's like, that you didn't want that much. But that's not what gift exchanges are about, right? These are about it's about the social capital, right? It's about
Sure.
like building social relationships. It's not just about getting stuff.
Yeah.
and I think if you're perceiving it that way, you're maybe fundamentally missing the point.
Sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's hard because there are certainly baseline conflicts, right? Even philosophically. And you don't want to create in your society something that is absolutely flat with no variation at all.
Yeah.
But I guess my point is if you try to put too much variation and make sure that there's in your particular New York City there's as much social difference as there is in real life New York City, it can mute the norms and mores of that particular culture that you're trying to get across. If you want to create this particular city where everybody takes their shoes off whenever they go inside, and yet there's 20% of people in the city that don't do that, and there's 25% of the people in the city that take them off in the foyer instead of outside literally, and then you just can end up muddling the message you're trying to send by trying to add in too much of the butting heads of the norms which always exist. So there's a balance there, and I'm not sure exactly how to develop it well, but you don't want to let it lapse because there is variance, there is diversity, and it's important to show that. But you also don't want to mute what different cultural norms you want to actually play up in this particular location.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just the fundamental challenge of storytelling, right? Is that you are curating a list of the things that are important and relevant. And if you choose to say something, right, it probably has meaning, right? And and if it doesn't, then maybe you've messed up in some way, right? This is the Chekhov's gun rule, right? If you introduce a gun in Act 1, it should, right? Someone needs to be shot with it in Act 3 or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. Now we're getting into fields that I'm not an expert in, but I think that's the gist of it. And so you're deciding what's important, and you probably want to make sure the stuff that you're saying is relevant.
Sure. Now, speaking of all of these different things, the final question that we've touched on a lot already, is what potential is there for misunderstanding? Because whenever we're interacting with different cultures and stuff, a lot of these norms and mores are stuff that the party is not going to have interacted with before, right?
Yeah, and I think we've done a lot of the sort of content I wanted to cover regarding this already, but I do want to just sort of really highlight that sort of cross-cultural interactions and comparisons are a really fundamental part of anthropology as a discipline, and they're a really important way to highlight. I mean, we just mentioned curating this list of things that are important to the players as you're telling a story, and a great way to highlight what's important is to highlight these differences, right? You don't need to tell them all the things that are the same about this place that they're in now. You need to figure out what is different, what's going to feel weird to them, and how are they going to discover that, right? Because when you show up to a new place, the people who live there don't say, "Hi, welcome to our society. Here's a list of all the things that are that are unique about it," right? They're just living their lives in the way that they're used to living their lives. And so you as the storyteller have to figure out, like, how in the course of those people living their lives is it going to become apparent to your players that this place is weird and unique and shocking maybe to them.
Sure. Now, of course, all this stuff we could talk about for a lot longer than we have, and we've talked for a long time already. But these 4 little things that we can think about as we're developing our particular settings. Thinking about the location of the particular settlement and where the society is, thinking about the important social categories, thinking about the norms and the mores, and thinking about the potential for misunderstanding. Those are things which can help us build authentic societies for our players to play in and interact in, which will feel really interesting and authentic in our particular worlds. But I think that's about all the time that we have for the prime material. Let's head out into the wilds and look at a nilbog.
Let's do it.
Right, we're out here in the wilderness. What we looking at today?
Well, today we're looking at the nilbog. So tell me what the heck this thing is.
Well, for those of you that are unaware, nilbog is goblin backwards, and this is quite literally a goblin being turned on its head. The lore to these is the most important thing. The chief goblin deity Maglubiet, at some point in time in the past, defeated the previous goblin pantheon. And while there was some he kept around, there was a particular goblin deity, which was a trickster deity. And he vowed to get the last laugh. The Volo's Guide to Monsters lore says, where you can find it on page 182. And even though this deity was defeated and killed and the essence was shattered by Maglubiet, the trickster deity formed these spirits called nilbogs, which would essentially go around and possess goblins and turn them into lunatics. And essentially, they're just like a chink in goblin society. And they are extremely interesting to use just because of this lore factor. If you're in a place where goblins are located, having a nilbog in the middle of this particular society, or just having perhaps a nilbog interact with the party themselves directly as they are relating to a goblin society, can be really fascinating. As far as combat encounters go, they're only a challenge rating 1. They can cast some spells. They have a few interesting features, such as any creature that tries to attack them have to succeed on a saving throw first, or they're charmed by the nilbog. So there's different little interesting things that you can play up if you actually have a combat encounter with them. Mm-hmm. But personally, what really makes them interesting is just their place in goblin society and how crazy just this whole idea is.
Yeah. So how does a possessed, insane goblin act? I mean, is this like is it a reverse goblin? I mean, is it to have the character, like the opposite characteristics of goblins in terms of personality?
Well, to read straight out of Volo's Guide to Monsters, this possession turns the goblin into a wisecracking, impish creature, fearless of reprisal. And it gives the goblin strange powers that drive others to do the opposite of what they desire. So it is just trying to not literally turn it a 180, but it just is this particular shattered essence of this deity trying to throw a chink in goblin society.
Yeah, okay.
But at the same time, the goblins have kind of embraced it. They know not to kill a nilbog, because if they kill a nilbog, the spirit just repossesses a different goblin. So they just let it be. They just let it exist as part of their society. And even whenever they don't have a nilbog, there's even a practice where every goblin tribe, every goblin group has at least one jester. And even if it isn't a nilbog, this jester is just allowed to do whatever it wants. It's just, they're just indulged, quite literally, as the book says, because of this particular cultural thing that they just have now, of just this insane goblin that just exists within certain goblinoid tribes.
So yeah, I've got questions. I've got questions about it.
Yes, we all have questions about this. Well, this is why it's so awesome and funny.
So is there okay, so if the goblin that is possessed dies, the spirit, it just like escapes the corporeal body and possesses something else.
Yes.
So does that mean that there's just like that there are X number of nilbog spirits that exist in the world, and there will always be that many?
As far as I can tell, there's only a set number because of just the way that it actually was created, with the shattering of this particular trickster deity, and there's no actual way of getting rid of them at all. The stat block in Volo's guide actually gives you a couple of ways to deal with the entity if a goblin is possessed by a nilbog. Either kill the goblin, or you can affect it with spells like Hallow or Magic Circle or Protection from Evil for Good. But that will just kick this spirit out of that particular goblin, and it will search for another goblinoid. And it can only possess goblins.
Okay.
It can't,
so
so
if
it
you
can't
needed
actually,
something,
yeah.
if you needed a piece of information from a particular goblin and it was possessed by a nilbog before you got there, you would be able to expel the spirit and then get the information you needed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, that's actually a great way to use them. Perhaps you could,
Yeah. Okay.
you could interrogate this person and trying to find out information about this particular goblin encampment, and you're just dealing with a raging lunatic for some reason. But yeah, there's no way listed to actually kill these spirits or affect these spirits directly. They're just things that exist. And there's any number of ways you could use this. It's just a fascinating random aspect of a goblin culture, which is just fascinating to me, and I really want to use one in a scenario, just because it just can throw your party off so well, because it's just so random and so out of place. It's almost like if you're familiar with Magic the Gathering goblins, which are just not typical goblins. They're just the bumbling idiots of the multiverse in Magic the Gathering. You've got one of those transported into Dungeons and Dragon goblin lore, essentially, by one of these things. But yeah, they're fascinating little entities which can just create a really interesting and hilarious and memorable social encounter. So absolutely, try to find a way to use one in your games. But I think that will just about wrap up all the amount of time that we have out here in this goblin encampment. Let's say we head back to the tavern and get some refreshment.
Let's go.
All right, we're out here in the tavern. What's today's plot hook?
What would you do if there was a full moon?
Well, this is a little bit of a misnomer. I wrote it down because this was the easiest way to actually couch it in the introduction. But really, this isn't specifically about there being a full moon per se. It's about the use of astrological phenomena in our games. And I thought this was interesting because it's something which actually connects a lot with various cultures and societies who can have various beliefs or superstitions regarding uncommon phenomena in the sky, whether that's a full moon, something that happens periodically, or something like the aurora, or an eclipse, or a comet, or shooting stars, or
the solstice, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of different astrological events which have throughout human society been given various sorts of significance, from the most benign of a full moon makes everything crazy to the most extreme, a eclipse means the world is ending, type of scenario. Is there anything like that in Mayan culture where there's any sort of astrological thing which actually has any sort of significance to them?
Sure. I mean, the ancient Maya were excellent naked eye astronomers. I mean,
Hmm.
they weren't building telescopes or anything, but they were tracking the movements of the moon and the sun and the earth and Venus and the stars. So yeah, I mean, when you go back and read ancient Maya texts, oftentimes, so that they'll give you like a sort of block of text at the beginning that says this is when this is written. It's sort of like just a date, right? But every once in a while they'll give you like the full long form date that includes the position of Venus and the cycle of the moon
Mm.
and all of that stuff. So yeah, they were deeply concerned, and you often find buildings that are built so that the sun rises or sets aligned with a particular temple on the solstice or something like that.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um, so yeah, I mean, and they were doing all kinds of stuff related to the movement of celestial bodies.
sure. I think that's an awesome thing to include in our particular games and societies. It's a great little plot hook where you have just this party wandering through the wilderness, and either you have a legitimate effect of an astrological phenomena, like, there are werewolves in Dungeons and Dragons, where
Hmm.
all of a sudden there's a full moon and they have to fight some werewolves, to just going away from the literal effects that magic could impose based off of a real event, to the superstitions and different things which affect a society. Just because something's not real doesn't mean it doesn't affect things.
Sure, yeah,
Because just because you can look back and say that magic isn't real in real life, well, for people who believe that magic was real,
yeah,
it affected their daily lives,
yeah, right.
if they were interacting with it in some way.
It's actually a central tenet of anthropological thinking is that
Mm.
it's important to, well, I mean, the sort of the fancy way of saying it would be we want to recognize the ontological weight of people's claims, which is just a complicated way of saying if enough people believe something is true, it might as well be true, right?
Mm.
And so, like we've had periods of, like witch hunts in the United States.
Hmm.
Right? There was in not that long ago, around 1900, there was a vampire panic in New England.
Mm.
Right? And basically, this idea of recognizing the ontological weight of people's claims is saying, like, look, if everyone in society believes there are witches that are casting spells on people, or there are vampires who are hunting people from beyond the grave, then for all intents and purposes, it sort of is true, right? People are living as if it is true.
Hmm.
And so how different is that from it being true? And so, if for people who were burned at the stake for being witches, right, I bet that felt pretty real,
Yeah. Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, keep that in mind that like if an entire group of people believes something strong enough, it's gonna feel pretty real.
Yeah, and coming across a particular situation like this in your setting, when you're coming across perhaps a new town or a new location or a new village, anywhere where you haven't been before, or even somewhere where you have been, and you're interacting with the society's response to a particular phenomena, that could be an interesting way of hooking you into a story.
Hmm.
A particular cycle of the sun could tie you into whatever the equivalent of the sun deity is in your setting.
Yeah.
If something has happened to that temple or something. Same thing with the moon. Because most Dungeons and Dragons settings have some deity that's in charge of the sun and another one that is in charge of the moon. There could be just some sort of thing that is occurring in a particular place as a result of these phenomena, which can hook you into a larger narrative.
Yeah, and we spent a lot of time in this conversation talking about cultural differences, and a ceremony like this could be a great way to emphasize those.
Hmm.
It's very common to have harvest festivals right, that are triggered by certain astronomical events.
Mm.
Wandering into some sort of festival like that, right,
Hmm.
gets, maybe a lot of those sort of features on full display for people.
Sure. It can also be a way of, if you're talking about a place where you've been before, it can add some more color and some more variety to a society. Because if it's something where maybe you just passed in and you were like, you stopped here, you talked to the smithy and bought some armor and then kept going because that wasn't your destination. This town wasn't your destination. Where now you're traveling back through this town. And now, because of this particular event, something is different, whether it's a cultural phenomenon or something has actually happened because of this event. You've subverted the player's expectations because they're coming back into this situation expecting everything to be just like it was. And this has changed something for some reason or another.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, lots of different ways that you can use this. So think a little bit about the astrological if you're trying to come up with the next hook into an arc in your adventure. Maybe you can cue into it with something related to an aurora or an eclipse or something like that. But I think that's about all the time that we have for this episode of Plot Hooks. Thanks very much for joining us, Dave.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
We're glad to have you back again. Look forward to doing it again soon. Thank you all out there for listening. From all of us here at the Plot Hooks team, I'm Samuel. That's Dave. Thanks from Matt, Mike, Steve, Zach, Becca, and of course, podcast pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.